Okay, we've reached 7 o'clock by my estimation, so we'll get started. If you've joined us for a couple different webinars, you'll be used to my little blurb here in the beginning. But I'd like to welcome you all to Manitoba Important Bird Areas Program second annual webinar series. This is the last webinar of our spring webinar series, so thank you to everybody who's attended so far and who is here tonight. My name is Amanda, and I'm the coordinator for the program, and I will also be your presenter for the day. So a couple of housekeeping comments. You probably heard this webinar is being recorded. Everyone in the webinar today, I ask that you please keep your microphones muted during the presentation, and we will have time for questions as well. If you have a comment you're worried you will forget, please type it into the chat, which is shown by the little speech bubble icon. And yeah, if you'd like to ask a question during the question period, feel free to unmute yourself, which is the little microphone button. If you are muted, it will be gray, and if your microphone's on, it will be green. Questions are being recorded, so if we do not get to all of them today, I will get the answers to you back through email. So without further ado, we will start off, and today we're highlighting habitat for species at risk. You can see that even just on the bottom image I have here, there are a wide variety of species at risk in Manitoba. And I will be basing today's presentation off a report that came out in 2019 called State of Canada's Birds. And in this report, the authors looked at changing bird populations starting in 1970 and going up to 2016. And as you can see, they grouped the birds not necessarily taxonomically, but sort of functionally, I guess, with waterfowl, birds of prey, wetland birds, forest birds, etc. And you can see a wide variety in how well these groups of birds are doing. So we've got birds like waterfowl and birds of prey, whose populations are increasing quite a bit. We've got a group of birds in the middle, the wetland birds, the Canadian nesting birds, forest birds, just other birds that weren't classified elsewhere, whose populations have been fairly steady. And then we've got the shorebirds, the grassland birds, and the aerial insectivores, the birds that eat insects on the wing, whose populations are declining. So there has been a successful concentrated effort to help some groups of birds increase their populations. But there's also birds whose populations are declining, often who are often more strongly impacted by more complicated threats, such as climate change or human disturbances to habitat, or both. And these are generally wider threats that it's harder for us to control and help mitigate. And if you were at our Grasslands Bird webinar last week, this slide will look very familiar to you, but just in case you weren't, I'll be using the phrase species at risk a lot. And species at risk are basically species whose populations are declining significantly, and we are somewhere in the spectrum of being at risk of losing them. So there are two different acts, one that's federal and one that's provincial, that governs species at risk. And federally, we have the Species at Risk Act, and provincially, we have the Endangered Species and Ecosystems Act. And sort of the different levels of risk for these birds is if they're not classified under either of these acts, they're not considered at risk legally. Under the federal act, we have species being special concern, and that's sort of the lowest level, the least at risk. And then moving up, both acts have a threatened category, they have an endangered category, and they have an extirpated category. And extirpated is when a species is no longer found in an area that it previously was. So I have a picture of a prairie chicken here. They used to be found in Manitoba along with the United States and other areas in Canada. And they're still found in other areas, but they're no longer found in Manitoba. So this would be a species that is extirpated from Manitoba. So our program is the Manitoba Important Bird Areas program. And the reason why I bring this up is that one of the criteria for establishing an important bird area is significant populations of a species at risk. So quite a few of our IBAs were designated as holding species at risk, and you'll see them as I go through and talk about the habitats for these species. But even where these species occur in Manitoba important bird areas, there's no specific protection associated with that title. They do sometimes contain areas such as provincial parks or WMAs, wildlife management areas, that might have protection associated with them. But generally, they are designated as tools to highlight areas of key habitat for birds, to have outreach with local populations, and to give people an idea of where they can go to see these special birds. So there's two categories from the State of Canada's birds reports that I'll just touch on really briefly, because we did have past webinars about them. So last week our webinar was on grassland birds. So I'm not going to get into this category for species at risk. However, grassland birds have some of the strongest declines of all groups of birds, with 57% decline since 1970 for all grassland bird species, and an 87% decline for species that are dependent on native grasslands. And the major issues for grassland birds are climate change, as well as habitat destruction and degradation. We only have between 1 to 10% of our prairie still left, depending on if you're talking about mixed grass prairie habitat or tall grass prairie habitat. So habitat destruction and degradation has been a major impact for them. And then the other group that I'm just going to touch on really briefly, because we did have a webinar for these guys, it was several weeks ago now with Christian Artuso, is the shorebirds. So shorebirds are another group of species that are also have been really on the decline for a while. Short distance migrant shorebirds have declined 23%, and long distance migrant shorebirds have declined 52% since 1970. And some of the major threats to these birds have been loss of shoreline habitat all throughout their annual cycle, on their wintering grounds, on their migration stopover sites, as well as at their breeding sites. As well, these threats generally impact long-distance migratory birds more strongly than short-distance migratory birds. And this is true not just for shorebirds, but you see this difference between long-distance and short-distance migratory birds in general. Long-distance migratory birds often have to spend more time traveling, which means their migrations are more stressful. There's more time for them to be impacted by severe storms and storms that are happening more often due to climate change. They have more stopover sites, so they're more at risk for habitat loss, and the list goes on. So our first category that we'll really start getting into are some more of the water and wetland associated birds, but these guys will be new to us tonight, and that is the waterfowl species, such as geese, ducks, and other wetland birds. And you can see their graph looks quite a bit different than the shorebird and the grassland bird graphs. We're still looking at changes since 1970, but you can see they're generally doing quite a bit better. There are some blips there which represent drought cycles in the prairies. Not sure if we're heading into, well, we are heading into a dry year this year, but I guess time will tell whether that will continue and if that will become a blip, or if this will be just a single season anomaly. But generally, many waterfowl species have been positively impacted by cross-border conservation and stewardship work across North America between Canada, the US, and Mexico. A lot of these waterfowl species would be considered short-distance migrants, so they don't go all the way to South America. So work within North America has been key for these guys. And you'll see the goose species is up quite high. Waste grain has helped the population of birds like geese take off. So you may have heard about the booming population of snow geese. But despite all of these generally increases in population, we do still have species at risk within this category. So we'll get started with that now. So our first species at risk within the water birds is the horned grebe. The horned grebe is categorized as special concern under the Federal Species at Risk Act, and it has no classification under the Provincial Act. The horned grebe is a small grebe with a black head and back and cinnamon-colored neck and sides. They have golden horns in quotation marks going up from their eyes, which you can see clearly in the picture there. And your male and female grebes will generally look the same. In terms of habitat that they use small to moderately sized shallow ponds and wetlands, and they build floating nests out of vegetation. So they do require emergent vegetation or submerged vegetation to build these nests. And they do need a protected area for the nest, although you will see them foraging out in open water. Grebes are diving birds and they're very agile. They may look quite a bit like ducks, although generally they're more slender and you can see the bill is different. But grebes do not actually have webbed feet like ducks do. They have lobed feet, so the feet will look kind of like individual toes, and there'll be lobes of skin, and that's how they are able to paddle around and have their unique diving capabilities. So if you're looking to see the horned grebe, spots you can see them are the Netley-Leebow Marsh on the south end of Lake Winnipeg, Oak Hammock Marsh, the Shoal Lakes IBA, which is up near Inwood, Manitoba. There are multiple shoal lakes in and around Manitoba, so I'll specify it's the Shoal Lakes near Inwood. Proven Lake IBA, which is south of Riding Mountain National Park, Whitewater Lake, as well as the Oak Lake Plum Lakes area. And our next bird is the least bittern. So the least bittern is a type of heron related to things like the great blue heron or the American bittern. In Canada, they are categorized as threatened, and in Manitoba, endangered. They are a small heron, much smaller than if you picture like a great blue heron, with a pointed yellow bill and a hunched back appearance, which you can definitely see on that first picture. The males and females in this species look different, and the males have a broad dark green stripe that runs from their head down their back, whereas the females are dark brown on the back of their heads down to their back. In terms of habitat type, I actually have a picture that I've taken down below, which is where I've seen least bitterns before, and this was at the Shoal Lakes IBA, once again near Inwood, and they like to hunt along the edges of wetlands. They don't need to be like off in the middle of a pristine wetland necessarily. You can see this one's on the side of a road. They like wetlands with tall aquatic vegetation and interspersed with areas of open water and even some woody vegetation. So the behavior I saw was that it was up holding on to a cattail and waiting with its head down in order to strike out. So that's likely what they use some of that tall vegetation for, to be able to hunt successfully. So like I mentioned, you can see them at Shoal Lakes IBA. They've been seen at Oak Hammock Marsh, in eastern Manitoba, in the Spruce Siding area, as well as the western side of Whitewater Lake, which is southwest of Brandon. Our next water bird we're going to look at is the secretive yellow rail. So in Canada, they're classified as special concern, and in Manitoba, they are endangered. These guys are small with a short tail and a short yellow beak. They have buffy underparts and are dark above with some buffy streaking on their backs. I'm describing the way they look to you, but that almost doesn't matter because they're so rarely seen. They are way more often heard. So they are most vocal at dusk and at night. And I don't have the call for you, but it sounds like if you picked up two rocks and you were hitting them together or clattering them together. It is a very interesting sound, and yeah, I recommend you go and look it up on YouTube or on the internet. Yellow rails like shallow marshes with very short vegetation. Things like sedges. If you're not sure what sedges are, it looks superficially similar to grass, so very short, or short rushes. Even things like cattails in a habitat are too tall for the yellow rail. Their breeding sites do change from year to year as water levels do. So if an area was too wet previously, and for example, this year things are drier, if it's dried out, yellow rails may move into that area. And vice versa, if their normal breeding site has been too wet, they will simply move elsewhere. We don't have too many spots to see or hear yellow rails in Manitoba. The most well-known site is the Douglas Marsh Important Bird Area, which is near Brandon. This IBA was designated for the yellow rail. And you can also sometimes see or hear them in the Southwestern Mixed Grass Prairie IBA, which is right down in the southwestern corner of Manitoba, but it's much bigger, and they are usually more concentrated at Douglas Marsh. So that's probably where I would recommend that you go. Our next species at risk is the Trumpeter Swan. So it has no status under the federal legislation, but it is endangered under the Manitoba legislation. Trumpeter swans are a large white bird. You're not going to get a swan mixed up with any other bird. However, we do have two species of swans in Manitoba, the Trumpeter swan, which I have in the big picture up top, and we also have tundra swans. And they can be distinguished from each other by voice, the bit of a difference in shape, and the amount of black from bill to eye. However, it is sometimes very tricky. Trumpeter swans can occur in a variety of sizes of water bodies, and they can also be seen feeding in grassy areas, sometimes quite a distance from the water. You can see trumpeter swans in a variety of places. I've just picked a few here, but you can see them at Okamic Marsh, Whiteshell Provincial Park, and the Shoal Lakes IBA. And like I said, I would not be shocked if you told me you saw a trumpeter swan elsewhere, because they can use a variety of different sizes of water bodies. Our next water bird we're looking at is the Ross's gull, which is threatened federally and endangered in Manitoba. To me, this is a very elegant looking gull, very slender with a slender black bill. And they are all white with a thin black necklace that runs from the back of their neck, sort of down the neck and under the chin. They have a pink wash to their underparts, or they can. And the pink wash is caused by the food they eat. So depending on what they're eating, they may have more or less of a pink wash. If you are in southern or central Manitoba, you likely will not see the Ross's gulls. They are a bird of the high Arctic. They nest in the high Arctic marshy tundra and delta areas and areas with low willows. And oftentimes, if we're trying to see an Arctic breeding bird, we watch for them on migration. But these guys actually never come south. They winter along the pack ice. So if you want to see them, my suggestion is to head up to Churchill. Up there we have the Churchill and vicinity IBA, but really it would be looking around Churchill. So that's it for our water and wetland bird species at risk. And so we're going to move into our group of birds that use the forest. So we'll be looking at the boreal forest, aspen woodlands, as well as the mix between the two. And so forest birds are a bit of a mixed bag with their changes since 1970. We can see that species that are wintering in Canada are generally doing better than species that are wintering in South America. And sort of just overall, this equals out to forest birds doing okay. Populations aren't really changing sort of as a whole, as a group. In terms of the discrepancy between the species wintering in Canada and the species wintering in South America, this is another way of getting at the short distance versus long distance migrants. So we talked about that with shorebirds. So species of forest birds who winter in South America have to migrate a much longer distance than a species who winters in Canada. So those long distance migrants face the more challenging migration. They have to go further. They can be more impacted by weather. By the time they get back to North America, for example, in the spring, is there a match of when they arrive versus the weather conditions? So it's a lot more challenging in general. As well, while there is forest loss both in North America and South America, there is more forest loss currently going on in South America, so that impacts forest birds in their wintering grounds. This group is also quite largely impacted by both outdoor cats and window kills, which unfortunately take out a large portion of birds. And yeah, climate change also negatively impacts forest birds. This can be through things such as insect outbreaks, as well as forest fire that reduces the habitat available to them. So moving into the boreal / mixed wood forest here, I've classified these birds into boreal forest and aspen woodlands, but really there is a continuum. So just keep that in mind when we're going through these bird species. So the first one we'll look at is the extremely charismatic Canada warbler, and they are threatened federally and provincially. The Canada warbler is a medium-sized warbler. I would guess about the size of your fist. If you see them, they are quite easy to recognize. Both males and females are gray on the back and bright yellow along the underparts from throat to rump. They both have a streaky black necklace around their necks. It is much darker on the males than the females. So we have a female in the top picture and a male in the middle picture there. They have a large eye ring with a large eye with a full white eye ring, which is quite visible. And I've got a picture of sort of typical Canada warbler habitat down below. They're mainly found in boreal forest areas, in areas with shrubby or mossy understory, and they can be found near water. This doesn't mean we don't see them come through, say, Winnipeg on migration. Sort of all bets are off in terms of habitat with migration as they pass through, but their breeding habitat is boreal forest. So spots to see the Canada warbler: Whiteshell Provincial Park, Noping Provincial Park, sort of southeastern eastern Manitoba, I guess, and Riding Mountain National Park. And you certainly can find them in the boreal forest in sort of north central Manitoba. Just people tend not to go there as often, so we don't get as many reports. Our next bird is the rusty blackbird. Rusty blackbird is classified as special concern in Canada and does not have a listing under Manitoba law. This is a blackbird with a slender bill and light eyes. The males are glossy black with a greenish tinge in the light. So they may look quite plain black until the light hits them, and then they're a beautiful iridescent color. And the females are brownish to rusty colored. So we've got the male on the top picture and the female in the second picture. The rusty blackbird breeds in wet forests with bogs, fens, muskeg, or beaver ponds. And interestingly, rusty blackbirds display a high breeding site fidelity between years, where they'll come back to the same nest site year after year and use it again and again. So these spots where I'm listing where you can see them are generally where we see them on migration, either in the spring or in the fall. And they're sites such as Riverton's Sandy Bar near the town of Riverton, Netley-Leebow Marsh on the south end of Lake Winnipeg, Oak-Hammock Marsh, and Delta Marsh on the south end of Lake Manitoba. I would say we generally don't see them as often in the breeding season just because of their habitat. A lot of people are not slogging through the fen, bog, muskeg area where they are breeding. And next we have the olive-sided flycatcher. So we'll be talking about two flycatchers. The next one we'll have just after this. And in federal and provincial legislation, the olive-sided flycatcher is threatened. They have a gray back, head, and tail with light underparts. The breast of the bird has a strong vested look where it kind of looks like it's put on a vest, and you can see in the top picture there the vest is gray, and then the breast underneath is white. And depending on how they hold up, their feathers, their head sometimes looks peaked on the top. And they're found in boreal or mixed wood forests, and they like edges, clearings, and areas nearby to wet habitats. And you can also look for them on snags, standing dead trees. And they like to sit on these trees and sally out and grab insects, and then come back and sit on the tree and eat, and then look for their next insect, and so on and so forth. So some places where you can catch the olive-sided flycatcher is Hecla Island, Riding Mountain National Park, Netley Bow Marsh, and the Milner Ridge area in eastern Manitoba. Next, we have the eastern wood pewee. This is a flycatcher with a gray back, head and tail, and light underparts, which sounds very similar to the previous bird we just looked at. You can see by looking at this bird's breast, it has a much less distinct vested look than our previous flycatcher. They do have that gray, but it's that distinction between that and the rest of the breast is basically just a small line down the middle. They're seen in clearings or forest edges in a wide variety of habitats, including woodlots, urban habitats, roadsides, mature woodlands, etc. And they like to sit on open branches and call. They also sit on branches and do the sallying out for insects behavior, the same as our previous bird did. So spots where you can see them are Oak Lake, Plum Lakes IBA, Pembina Valley Provincial Park in southern Manitoba, all across eastern Manitoba. My example here is Haddishville, but in a wide variety of locations, and also all around the South Basin of Lake Winnipeg. Our next bird is another charismatic warbler, and that is the golden-winged warbler. They are threatened both federally and provincially. And as with a lot of warblers, the males and the females do look different. So we've got a male in the top right and a female in the middle picture. The male is silver gray with yellow on the head and wings, and they also have a black mask and throat. And the females are more of a buffy gray instead of a silver gray, but have a similar but duller pattern of yellow with yellow on the head and the wings. Their black mask is kind of reduced to a kind of grayish mask, and the throat, instead of being black, is a bit more of a darker golden color again. Interestingly, golden-winged warblers can hybridize or breed with the blue-winged warblers where their ranges overlap, and the young have the dominant characteristics of blue-winged warblers. So there's some debate whether these guys are different species or not. In Manitoba, we generally don't have blue-winged warblers, so our golden-winged warblers generally look like golden-winged warblers. There's a lot of debate in that issue. So if you want to look into it more, there's lots you can find online in academic papers and stuff like that. Golden-winged warblers like patchy habitats recovering from disturbance that are nearby to mature habitat. So if you look at the habitat picture I have here on the bottom, you can see that wherever the person is standing taking the picture, that's the patchy recovering habitat. It's a clearing, maybe it was logged, maybe there was a forest fire in that area some years previous. But then you've also got the mature habitat sort of just past that. So that's prime golden-winged warbler habitat. Places that you might go to see golden-winged warblers, including the St. Genevieve area in eastern Manitoba, sort of eastern Manitoba in general, Riding Mountain National Park on the east side of the park. In migration, I know they've been seen in city parks in Winnipeg, so it is possible. Like I said, kind of all bets are off on migration. You find birds sometimes where you wouldn't expect them. And next we have the red-headed woodpecker, threatened in Canada and Manitoba, but I actually just got an email the other day where I think that, I don't know if it's happened yet, but they are going to be bumped up to endangered in Canada. So this is possibly slightly out of date. I don't know if it's officially happened yet or not. But red-headed woodpeckers are a beautiful woodpecker. They have a ruby red head that really shines when the light hits it. White breast, and they have their back and wings are black with white patches on the wings. In their habitat photo below, you can see they like woodlots and farmyards with sparse dead or dying aspen or oak with very little understory. And they use that dead or dying trees for cavities, for nests, and they will reuse their nests from year to year. So they are a cavity nesting bird. Despite them being threatened or now endangered across Canada, Manitoba is actually kind of a bit of a hot spot for them. We have them in several spots in decently high concentrations, like the Shoal Lakes area near Inwood, the Oak Lake, Plum Lakes IBA on the eastern side, Kinnesota-Lefeur IBA, which is on the eastern side of Riding Mountain National Park, the Netley-Libau Marsh IBA south of Lake Winnipeg, as well as the area in southern Manitoba, sort of in and around Saint Jean-Baptiste. And now we are hitting our last category of birds that we're going to look at from the State of Canada's Birds Report. And they kind of got lumped together, even though they're not very similar to each other at all. But we've got the birds of prey, whose populations have been increasing since 1970, as well as the aerial insectivores, whose populations have been declining since 1970. And that's not to say that there are tons of birds of prey around, but a main issue that used to impact birds of prey was the use of DDT as a pesticide. And this DDT had concentrated in these birds' prey, such as small mammals. And then as these birds of prey would eat, say, multiple ground squirrels or multiple mice, this pesticide would become concentrated in their body, and it was causing large amounts of die-off. DDT was banned in Canada, United States in 1970 and Mexico in 1990s. So since then, we've generally seen populations increase. So like I said, it's not that there's a ton of them now, but it's that their populations were quite low before. In terms of aerial insectivores, they have been negatively impacted by declines in insect population through things like insecticides and through climate change. There's also been a loss of habitat as it is converted to agricultural land. So we're going to go through the aerial insectivores first, and these are birds that eat insect on the wing. And you'll see, because they are declining quite strongly, there are a number of them that are species at risk. So the first one we're going to go through is the barn swallow. The barn swallow is threatened federally and is not under the Species at Risk Act, the Endangered Species and Ecosystem Act provincially. So barn swallows have long pointed wings and a long, deeply forked tail, and they are quite acrobatic and they fly quite fast. So that tail is often a great way, if you just get a quick look at them, to identify them. They are metallic blue above with a rusty throat and a cream to rusty colored underparts. And you can't see very well in the picture I have here because it's just the underside, but you see the two white dots. And then on the top side of the tail, there'll actually be a line of white dots across. And as people probably know, the barn swallow builds mud cup nests on both human-made and natural structures, such as barns. This photo is of the little covered pagoda picnic area at Okamic Marsh, sides of buildings, etc. They forage in open areas, including parks and farmyards, and they like to have open water nearby. A lot of aerial insectivores are found near open water. Their prey is insects, and a lot of insects have a larval stage that is aquatic. So we tend to see a large variety and abundance of insects near water. Spots to see barn swallows include Okamic Marsh, Delta Marsh on the south end of Lake Manitoba, Whitewater Lake in western Manitoba, Oak Lake, Plum Lakes in western Manitoba, and many others. We can see them generally all across southern Manitoba, so long as you're looking in the right habitat. Our next aerial insectivore we'll look at is another swallow. This is the bank swallow that is threatened in Canada. They are brown above both their wings and their backs, And a key spot to look to identify them when they're winging overhead is that white throat and breast with broken up with that dark sort of line around the collar. No other swallows have that pattern. Their tail is slightly forked, but not nearly so much as the barn swallow. As their name suggests, they nest in burrows along stream banks, bluffs, sand quarries, and road cuts. And they actually make their burrows themselves. So they don't use a burrow that was made by some other animal or bird. They excavate their own with their feet and with their beak. And like barn swallows, they also like to forage in areas with open habitat and near water. Places to see them, it's a lot of similar spots: Delta Marsh, Netley-Leebow Marsh, Okamic Marsh, Shoal Lakes IBA near Inwood, Oak Lake Plum Lakes, and Whitewater Lake in western Manitoba. And our next aerial insectivore we'll look at is the chimney swift, which is threatened both in Manitoba and in Canada. When you see them, they're generally quite high up overhead. They are a cigar-shaped bird with long curved wings, and you can really see the curve of the wing with this bird that's in flight. They're a light brown color all over, but like I said, they're often up quite high, so they might be seen, they may be heard before it's seen. I have that mixed up there in the text, as it forages quite high above the ground. And they make a chittering call. It almost sounds like they're talking to each other, which is quite loud. They nest primarily in chimneys and urban habitats. Their previous nesting site was a lot of sort of open dead trees and caves, but a lot of that habitat is no longer there, and they've adapted to live in chimneys or in artificial chimney structures, like the photo of the chimney in the bottom left, which is at Assiniboine Park Zoo. So basically the chimneys must be open and unlined so that chimney swifts can get in, wide enough so that they can fit, and they also like to be nearby to trees and water. And like I said, they like places with urban habitat because they need the chimneys. Winnipeg, Brandon, Selkirk, Portage la Prairie, Morden, Swan River, many small towns all across southern Manitoba have chimney swifts and have older buildings with chimneys that they use. Our second last bird for the aerial insectivores we'll look at is the common nighthawk, which is threatened both Canada and in Manitoba. They are a medium-sized bird that looks slender in flight. They have long wings. They are very cryptically patterned, very camouflaged. However, when they're in flight, they have white wing patches that are quite obvious. You can see the wing patches a little bit when they are at rest, but it's only a thin stripe sort of on the bottom leading edge of the wing as they have them tucked. They have a very small beak and a slightly forked tail, which you can see in the middle picture. They nest on the ground in open areas, clearings, gravel bars, etc. They're not seen as often as some other birds, as they are active at dawn and dusk, and they roost during the day on trees or on the ground. And they can be found in all kinds of rural and urban habitats. So some spots you could try to see and or hear them are Proven Lake IBA, the Riding Mountain National Park, eastern Manitoba in the Whiteshell or St. Genevieve area, around Winnipeg, Okamic Marsh, Netley-Leebow Marsh. And our last aerial insectivore is even more cryptic and camouflaged than the common nighthawk, and that is the eastern whippoorwill. And once again, they are also threatened provincially and federally. They are quite stout looking, whereas the nighthawk looks quite slender. The whippoorwill looks quite stout. It's almost like a little ball with a tail and a little bump for the head. They have a gray and brown cryptic pattern, so they're very camouflaged. They are also active at dawn and dusk and roost during the day. And they do say their name, or call their name, I guess, sometimes quite insistently and possibly for hours at a time. So if you live rurally, you may have heard them calling. They nest in deciduous or mixed woods habitat in areas with little underbrush, and they like to be close to open areas to forage, and they nest on the ground in leaf litter. So you can really see in the one who's perched on the ground on the leaves there that they camouflage very well. And spots to see or hear eastern whippoorwill include Delta Marsh, Winnipeg Beach areas, the areas around Winnipeg, especially in migration, and eastern Manitoba, such as St. Genevieve and Sandylands, is where the highest sort of reported concentration of eastern whippoorwills is in Manitoba. And so the last bird we'll talk about here is one of our birds of prey that is a species at risk, and that is the peregrine falcon. In Canada, peregrine falcons are classified as special concern, and they are endangered in Manitoba. They are quite small, much smaller than an eagle, and smaller than a lot of our hawks. They are dark gray above, including a dark gray helmet on the head. They have a cream-colored throat, and they're barred all under their wings and their breasts, which you can see in that photo with the falcon flying. They breed in rural or urban landscapes on cliff faces or skyscrapers. There aren't a ton of cliff faces in Manitoba, but we do have them breeding on buildings and on skyscrapers. And so we actually have an organization that follows the peregrines and helps in their recovery in Manitoba called the Peregrine Falcon Recovery Project. And that bottom photo of the bird sitting down is from them. And they actually put out photos and nest cameras and band and have names for some of these peregrine falcons in Manitoba. So some of the spots that they follow where you can look to see for peregrine falcons include the Radisson Hotel in Winnipeg, the Mackenzie Seat Building in Brandon, and the Selkirk Generating Station. And they are quite active on Twitter. So if you want to see peregrine falcon photos, I would check them out at MB Peregrines on Twitter. And I'm not sure if their nest cameras are up for this year. There might be someone in the audience here who knows better than me, but last time I checked, it didn't seem like they were operational yet, but they were working on it. So perhaps stay tuned to them for more peregrine falcon announcements. And yeah, so that's the end of my presentation here. I'd just like to say sort of a couple more words on species at risk. And the first is that in terms of I guess a challenge for birding or going out to try to find a bird, the peregrine falcons, or sorry, the peregrine falcons, the species at risk often present a challenge and a bit of a puzzle and a bit of a hunt, as you might say. But also it can be really important to report when you see species at risk, not just through eBird, which a lot of people use, but we also have the Manitoba Conservation Data Center, which is provincially run and is partnered with NatureServe, and they take sightings of species at risk. And these sightings are used by provincial and academic biologists. They're used when, say, construction projects like transmission lines or roads are going through a certain area to try to mitigate the impacts or avoid areas where species at risk are found. So if you do go out and you're searching and finding some species at risk, it can be important and it can be useful to report those findings as well. Yeah, so that about wraps it up for me, and I'm happy to take questions. And I did see a comment on here. Looks like we have so from Lewis, we have our warblers in general all in decline. I believe a lot of them are, Lewis. A lot of warblers breed in the boreal forest, and while we do have a lot of boreal forest, they are a small bird and they face a lot of, I guess, challenges in making their way here in terms of climate change, as well as a lot of them do overwinter in South America and are facing that habitat loss there, as well as, of course, once they reach their breeding grounds in Canada, we're definitely not immune to the impacts of forest loss for these birds. Oh, and Phil says the peregrine webcam is active. 4 eggs due to hatch soon in the next 10 days or so. So I'm thinking that's probably the Radisson camera. But yeah, it sounds like there might be action in the next couple of days if you want to start watching something on like a second screen at work. But yes, Barbara says that it is the Radisson peregrine falcons that are on the bird cam, or the falcon cam, I suppose. Barb asks, are there particular ethics around stalking these threatened or endangered birds? So I would say in general, you'd want to follow the same ethics you would follow for all other birds, which is if you are watching a bird and it is exhibiting its normal behavior, then you're fine. Obviously, you don't want to get too close. You don't want to scare the bird, say, off a nest or stop it from foraging. So you always want to watch the bird and make sure it's exhibiting its normal behavior. For things like birds of prey, which this is less of an issue for peregrine falcons, but birds of prey in general, you don't want to be baiting them to draw them out or to get a photograph, that kind of thing. There are some specific birds where, for example, if you report them through eBird, their location will be blurred because they are quite rare. And the first example that comes to mind for me for this are piping plovers and the occasionally sighted whooping crane. So in terms of something like that, you'd want to report them to the rare bird group in Manitoba or through the Conservation Data Center. Because those birds are so critically endangered, we don't want large groups of birders flocking to them and possibly disturbing them. And Lewis mentioned that trumpeter swans seem to be doing very well here in Manitoba. And I'm not sure about the actual statistics, but anecdotally, I would agree with you, Lewis. I hear, seems like every year, more and more people are seeing more and more trumpeter swans. So I haven't quite looked into that to see if there's an actual trend there. But like I said, anecdotally, that does seem to be the case. And we're probably hearing from a lot of the same people on the same birding channels on that. So Dry said, saw 5 trumpeter swans at Fort White Alive today. So for those of you of Winnipeg, if you want to head out to Fort White Alive and check out some trumpeter swans. And Linda says, how do you report to the Conservation Data Center? So if you Google Manitoba Conservation Data Center, I believe their provincial page will pop up. It is on the provincial website, and they have a form there. So they'd like you to try to get your location as close as possible. And I don't remember what else is on their: date, species, location. I think they'd like a brief description to make sure you saw the bird that you think you saw. And then I believe someone from the Conservation Data Center will contact you. And once you get in contact with them, you can ask other questions, or if you have a whole list of them, you can send them an Excel spreadsheet. They're quite flexible. Yeah, that their main contact page is on the provincial website. So Barb asked, endangered versus threatened. So endangered is basically the step before a species is extirpated or sort of wiped out in a specific area, and threatened is the one step below that. So we go special concerned, threatened, endangered, extirpated in terms of the sort of list category from least at risk to most at risk. And from Lewis, we have, are you optimistic about the aerial insectivores, or is it pretty grim for the future? This one is hard. I think right now, well, so the State of Canada's Birds Report as of 2016 showed them kind of leveling off. So that might be the case. I think it depends a lot in terms of which area you're in and which species you're looking at. A lot of the aerial insectivores are still on the species at risk spectrum. So I wouldn't be too optimistic until some of them start coming off. And I know there's also other aerial insectivores that are waiting to be assessed by COSEWIC to see if they should be on the species at risk list, such as the purple martin is one of them. So not too optimistic, but we'll see. You never know what can happen. There are sometimes species who are downgraded in terms of becoming less at risk. So that is definitely a thing that happens. From James, do you know if the Manitoba Conservation Data Center pulls or uses sightings from eBird or such citizen science stuff? Some other provincial CDCs do. I don't know offhand. Our program usually just reports directly to them. I assume if something really rare pops up, it probably makes their way to the Conservation Data Center regardless through like provincial species at risk biologists and stuff like that. But I don't know. That would be a good question to ask our contact. I think it probably would be a good idea. I'm just not sure if they have the staff or an automatic system set up to be able to pull from that on a regular basis. Oh yeah, James says just didn't want to double report if they're already automatically downloading. I'd say you're pretty safe, James. They would be able to look at the location reported on eBird versus the location that if an actual sheet was sent in to them or like the email form was sent in to them. Yeah, I think they'd be looking for that. So yeah, with that, looks like we are getting on to 8 o'clock here. So we will finish up, and thank you for the kind words, everybody. And we'll see what happens with COVID. Hopefully the Manitoba IBA program might be able to run some events a little bit later this summer. So I look forward to seeing you all in person rather than just online. But yeah, have a great evening, everybody. And thanks for sticking with us through tonight in our whole webinar series. Take care.